Just to give you a quick overview of what we're going to touch on today, we're going to start with a geopolitical overview because I'm sure as a lot of you know, and as Thomas alluded to earlier, that these things don't take place in a vacuum. We're then going to touch on what is going on in Yemen from an infrastructure and ownership perspective, the external parties there, and is cyber war going on there. We had two primary questions that we wanted to answer with this information that we gathered getting ready for this presentation. One, what is the temperature, the pulse of the internet in Yemen that is an active war zone? And number two, is there a cyber aspect to the civil war going on there? And hint, hint, we have a presentation about it, so yes. And so jumping into it, geography is super, super important, and geopolitics are super important for us to understand the conflict as a whole. Yemen is located at the southwestern end of the Arabian Peninsula in a pretty strategic location for Saudi Arabia, the Middle East as a whole, due to its controlling access there down by the Bab el Mandeb Strait that enters, gives access from the Indian Ocean up through the Red Sea, ultimately to the Mediterranean, and a very important shipping lane, and obviously gives access to the western coast of Saudi Arabia. With that, the demographics of the country play an important story in understanding the conflict there. As you can see, there's a large swath of green that represent Sunni Muslims and their tribes down there on the south and west coasts of the country, and then a smaller pocket of primarily Shi'i individuals and tribes in the northwestern corner of the country, and the rest of the grayed out area is not densely populated. And so with those demographic lines, it gives us an understanding of who is where in Yemen, and that primarily falls on who owns what. And so we can see with this large medium blue color, I apologize that they're not standing out very well on the screen, is the Hadi government, who is largely considered to be the internationally recognized government in the country, and they obviously have this large swath of territory. The other primary belligerent is the Houthi rebels, who occupy that upper left corner, matching up with their Shi'i demographic. And there's two other primary parties that we want to touch on here that we think are important. The Southern movement down in that darker blue swath, where they have mixed land holdings in and out with the Hadi government, as well as remnants that sort of ebb and flow of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State presence there. Those are this is a civil war, so it's really tough to balance who's who. But I feel okay saying Al-Qaeda are the bad guys. I really don't like them. But one thing that we definitely want to press on before we jump in a little bit further is that this is not a religious war. This isn't, while it is sectarian conflict because they're vying for control of these areas, it is not a, you're Shia, I'm Sunni, we're going to fight about it. But pulling back the veil on it, we see an interesting backing of each of these parties. And it's a civil war, and it's a war in the Middle East, so there are a lot of treaties and alliances of convenience. This is a little bit of an older map, but I think it illustrates the point nicely. Given how many different colors are on there, they show where these groups have aligned with each other. So to give you a quick run through, the Houthis are primarily backed and armed by Iran, as I'm sure you've all heard when these other sort of disinformation or Twitter trolls are going out and yelling about these sorts of things. On the flip side, the Hadi government is largely backed by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The Southern movement has been UAE funded, but is not fully spun up in the same way that they have the full political backing of that group. And pulling back a little bit more, the Hadi government has aligned both with the Southern movement as well as the Al-Qaeda instances in the country. Again, treaties of convenience. The Southern movement has backed out of treaties with both the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as well as the Hadi government because they're treaties of convenience. So when they need to take a city, especially a city that the Southern movement felt was key to them, they would join forces, they would get the Houthis out of there, and then they would pull back on the treaty and say, okay, we're now back to being combatants. Part of that interest for us is AQAP actually signed a treaty with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Hadis for a ceasefire to counter the Houthi growth in the country, which hasn't really stopped the US bombing the absolute crap out of those guys. So there have been rumors of an increased Al-Qaeda presence there in the last couple months. We cannot verify those things. We're not Stratfor or anyone like that, so we just want to make that clear. But there is still a definite presence in the country. Getting into the cyber aspect of all this largely follows the Houthi growth in the country. When they seized the capital of Sana'a, they gained access to the primary internet backbone in the country, which they then rapidly used to either block content related to their troop movements or propaganda against them, as well as either severed fiber optic lines entirely, cutting off access to largely Hadi or Sunni-backed areas of the country, and placed bans on Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, all the applications that you are all using in the audience right now to communicate with each other and make fun of me. So with that, getting a little bit of understanding of the geopol, going to turn it over to my colleague, Alan.
So to dive into a little bit deeper on what Greg had talked about, and you can tell I'm a lot older than my colleagues because I had to have lots of text in here, otherwise I'd never remember what I was going to say. So dial-up first came to Yemen in '96, which is the same year that the .ye TLD came online. As of the end of 2007, about 24% of the population in Yemen still had internet access despite years of war. However, it is one of the lowest countries in terms of aggregate bandwidth. So we see about 20 to 50 gigabits aggregate of bandwidth usage leaving Yemen at any given time. And it's lowest in terms of user bandwidth. So out of 189 countries, it ranks 189th. So you probably don't want to stream the latest season of Narcos while you're sitting in Yemen. Telecommunications infrastructure, that's phone, fiber, mobile, et cetera, is primarily controlled by Tele-Yemen, and that's their AS number. But the National Public ISP, the one that most people connect to, is Public Telecommunications Corporation, or as it's colloquially known as YemenNet. And most of YemenNet's infrastructure has been located in Sana'a, which is the capital. Which meant that when the Houthi rebels gained control of Sana'a in 2014, they also gained control of all of that infrastructure. They physically now had control of that infrastructure that they could do what they want with, and that includes the .ye CCTLD. Fun fact. Anybody who wants to make a quick buck, we did check. Con.ye is available for registration. You are, yes, supporting the Houthis, but you can turn around and sell it to them if you'd like. To counter the control that the Houthis now had over the entire YemenNet infrastructure, they created a rival ISP called AidNet, which bypasses Houthi control and routes out through entirely Saudi pipes. So this is kind of what that map looks like. Hey, look, there's the pointer. So you can see you have YemenNet and Tele-Yemen in control of the Houthi forces, but they also took control of the two primary mobile providers, MTN and Yemen Mobile. So all of that infrastructure is controlled by the Houthis. And still, most people in Yemen connect through those services. But then, again, the Haiti government set up AdNet, which we don't see a lot of traffic out of. So we know it's set up. We know it's functional. We don't know how many people are actually subscribing to it. I mean, switching from Verizon to Cox is a pain in the butt. I imagine switching from YemenNet to AidNet's just as challenging. And then the other thing that we're going to talk about is the submarine landing points. There are 3 landing points, but 5 different cables that are connected to that, and that has a lot to do with kind of the control that we're talking about. So this is just a visual representation of the size of the ISPs. We have a really good graphics person, so we wanted to let them have at it. I won't read you all the different net blocks, but I mean, because we only have 25 minutes. But this is just, again, to show representation. Tele-Yemen is relatively small, but it's a backbone provider, although some people do connect directly to it. Most people connect to YemenNet, and they've got access to about 150,000 total IP space. AdNet is much, much smaller. They have essentially 2 Class Cs that they have available for, and they route through, again, Saudi Telecom. Neither of the mobile providers have any net blocks. They rely on private IP addressing, and they don't always necessarily even use YemenNet IP space, although they do for their mail servers. If you do want to sign up for MTN, just star 555 pound, and you can get your account up and running. So we mentioned already that the submarine cables have landing points across Yemen's western port at Haldia and southern coast, Aden and Al Gaia. Telenet and YemenNet both use the AE1 cable for their routing. That is new since the Houthis took control. Prior to Houthis taking control, YemenNet actually routed out through the Saudi landline fiber, which is what AdenNet still seems to do. And what's important about that, and going back to this map, you'll see that where they route is actually under Haiti control, even though the Houthis are using that routing through the submarine cables. It's actually in Haiti-controlled territory, and the Haiti government is currently has Al Hodaya under siege. There's a lot of activity going on there, a lot of kinetic activity, and which means that if they do gain control of that area, in addition to being able to cut off access to food and other really important services, they would be able to cut off essentially any outside connection for the Houthi forces. In other words, they'd own all 3 fiber landing ports, and they'd be able to disable access so that nobody in the Houthi regime could route out. It wouldn't cut off internet access because you still route within country, but you wouldn't be able to route out, which means also that people wouldn't be able to see into what's happening.
So to take the mic from Alan a little bit here and to home in a little bit more on AdNet, it's a lot smaller of an ISP than YemenNet, as Alan had said before, stood up by the Hadi regime starting in June of this year, 2018, and uses a single flow from Saudi and built using Huawei routers. Now, for those of whom are familiar with Huawei, it's the massive Chinese telecom company with close ties to the PLA, and recently was banned from government use in both the United States and Australia due to espionage concerns. But why is China interested in Yemen in the first place, right? So you have, pre-existing defense ties with Saudi Arabia, suggesting that there's that initial relationship there. But more importantly, you have the Belt and Road Initiative. This is the massive undertaking of infrastructure projects that China has designed to project Chinese power overseas. And one of the more important shipping straits, as Greg had mentioned before, is the Bab al-Mandeb Strait. So this is a map of the Belt and Road Initiative. It goes right by Yemen and Djibouti, and increased stability there would be of great interest to them economically. So with all of these players and infrastructure in mind, you have this civil war that has all of these different parties, different interests, infrastructure, and capabilities. But why or how do they fit all together, right? How does Yemen's cyber capabilities or cyber infrastructure play out in this civil war? And to paraphrase Thomas Ridd a little bit in one of his books, most cyber war or activities associated with it can be structured into either subversion, espionage, or sabotage. While most people think of this as cyber weaponry or malware-enabled attacks, going from Stuxnet to the OPM hack to a simple DDoS attack, we've been able to actually find different types of cyber-enabled activities that may not be cyber weaponry-enabled, but still fall under these wider categories. So you first have the subversion of the Hadi regime simply by updating a government website. Every single .gov.ye, or at least most of them, have either been taken down or recrafted to make the Houthi government the legitimate presence online. You have pretty much every mention of the old regime after the taking of Sana'a wiped from most of these official government websites now that the Houthis control the .ye top-level domain. This particular website here is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Completely looks like it's legitimately Houthi run. You also have the sabotage of other parties' access to information simply through censorship. In 2015, the Citizen Lab put out this great report about the Houthis using NetSweeper in the IP space. So what NetSweeper is a tool that uses both web and DNS filtering to censor or block content. And through our research, we were able to find certain remnants still there. And obviously, what's censorship without the attempt to bypass it, right? So we've also been able to find Tor browsers, OpenVPN usage, IPsec VPN tunneling coming out of the Yemen IP space. So obviously, people in Yemen do know, or parties in Yemen, excuse me, do know that this censorship is happening and they want to go circumvent it. In addition, there's a large number of Yemeni home and business routers with DNS tunneling enabled. We assume that this is to actually get around some of the caching servers that may be helping YemenNet with additional censorship measures.
And to that point, when we say a lot, by looking at available router data using Shodan, about 25% of home DSL or WANX routers in YemenNet had DNS enabled. If you look at comparable countries, that number is usually around 5%. So that's a fairly significant uptick in the number of routers that have DNS enabled. So in addition to being able to use technical means for censorship, the Houthi forces have physically shut off access several times. Starting in April 2015, as they took control of the internet infrastructure, they shut it off initially completely. Then when they rebought it back on, that's when you started seeing the first complaints of users not being able to access WhatsApp, Twitter, and other services, other means of communications. In 2017, same thing, service was shut off. And then when it was restored, social media and secure messaging apps were no longer available to users. What we see is as the war waxes and wanes, censorship levels increase and decrease depending on what's happening. 2018, fiber optic cable cut in 3 places in Hidayah, causing disruption to 80% of Yemen. That was repaired and brought back online. And then November 2018, so just a couple weeks ago, mobile services were completely disrupted. These are instances where we think there was intent to disrupt. There also have been plenty of other instances where services was disrupted, frankly, because the Houthi government's incompetent and they don't have the technical means to properly implement a country-scale ISP. They've been forced to retain many of the original employees from YemenNet and TeleYemen, sometimes probably against their will, because they need them in order to actually keep everything up and running.
So speaking of YemenNet again, this is a fairly old ISP, so it comes to show that there's a ton of different sorts of legacy systems in here. A lot of major vulnerabilities in some servers that up until about September 2018 used to host over 500 domains. And then this also does not seem to be the first time that the Yemen ISPs have been put into Chinese hands. So this is the main name server, ns1.yemennet.ye, and it looks like there is a Tunda backdoor on this. Now, what that is a firmware remote code execution backdoor left in by, or for specifically Tunda routers, and this is a Chinese router company. We're uncertain as to whether or not the backdoor was left in there intentionally by the vendor or accidentally, but either way, it is still open for that sort of exploitation. Moving just into a wider lens, the internet in Yemen, like the internet elsewhere, doesn't operate in a vacuum, and I'm going to kind of show this save it for time, but there was just obviously a general presence of adware and spyware, basic C2s, a large increase in sample numbers submitted to VirusTotal over the last year or so, from 13 over 2 years to 164. I'm not sure why. Mostly Android-based, which is very interesting. And then the Chinese applications and malware, we were actually able to see applications uploaded to VirusTotal that were benign but meant for a Chinese audience, which is interesting, and malware packed with specifically Chinese software packers. This is just a general list. If you want to ask a few more questions about them, we can do that in the Q&A section. But last but not least, we actually found that the Houthi government is using cryptocurrency mining to generate funds for its regime. Now, this is particularly interesting if you think about the way Yemen is today. You see a lot of the news articles focusing on the famine and the economic disasters that are currently occurring within this country. And so we've found 973 CoinHive hosts on the YemenNet IP space, a lot of accounts that have been reused for multiple hosts. And most of these particular machines are located in the capital, Sana'a. Now, we can tell that this is Houthi because CoinHive was only created in 2017, a full 3 years after the Houthis took over the capital. This is another particularly internationally isolated regime trying to use alternative currencies to bolster themselves economically. As I'm sure you know, a lot of cryptocurrencies can be converted to hard currencies for aid, ammo, arms, to really make sure that they can keep themselves in power. The other more famous regime that's been internationally isolated that does this is North Korea, mainly for subverting international sanctions.
Yeah, and to wrap up and sort of pull this back, looking at other conflict zones, would we expect to see similar activity like this in Syria or Iraq, where like generally low-grade infrastructure is going to be interested by international parties, whether it's China, as we mentioned. Obviously, the U.S. has a vested interest in all these countries, as well as the more regional players in Iran and Saudi Arabia. All of that is to say that getting access to internet generally has followed the conflict in Yemen. So the Houthis' ability to seize the capital and gain access to control of the internet forced the Hadi government to stand up a whole new backbone. Would we see that other similar behavior amongst rival factions in other warring countries, and not just located in the Middle East, but abroad? Similar idea when we saw the use of the .ye TLD. Will we see that used elsewhere as well? I'm sure that Dan O'Keefe is going to mention something to that nature in his information operations talk that the Houthis are conducting. But that sort of creates a legitimacy for each of those factions to say, hey, look, we're the international, .ve if you're in Venezuela for whatever reason, to say, hey, we're the real government, and sort of create this de facto internet-based legitimization of their factions. And with that, we'll open up for questions. Thank you for your time.
Could you maybe in the additional time that you have talk through a little bit of your attribution for how you get from there being CoinHive hosts in Yemen to it being linked or enriching the Houthis? You know, there's a number of possible alternative explanations, like vulnerable hosts being compromised because this is a country under sanctions, under siege. Is there any, technical data or any sort of other metrics by which you can make that pretty substantial link?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk a little bit more about the specific. That's a great question, by the way. I'd love to talk a little bit more about the specific hosts that the CoinHive software is operating on. Definitely send me an email and I can give you the little more technical information. I don't know if, Alan, you want to touch a little bit on that?
So one of the things, you're absolutely right, that's a really good point, is there are certainly potentially other explanations, but one of the things that we noticed is all of these are microtick routers, which, as you know, are very vulnerable to this type of activity. However, we noticed that despite the fact that AIDANET and Tele-Yemen use the same microtik routers, we weren't seeing the same coin hive infestation on those routers. We were only seeing it in the Tele-Yemen, in the Yemen net routers, excuse me. And then the preponderance, the number of them, suggests that it was a local campaign that was being used by somebody who had local access. So if you compare it to another country of similar size or similar internet presence, there's significantly more coin hive infections, even at the same level of microtik routers with the same level, with the same type of vulnerabilities. So it appears to be a concerted effort concentrated specifically in Yemen net, which leads us to a medium confidence that it's actually started by the Houthi regime. But definitely email Winona and we can give you more details around some of the technical findings that we have.
So, we see a lot of foreign intervention in Yemen, particularly with respect to arms from both Saudi Arabia and Iran. And I was wondering if you guys could comment on the extent to which you see either of those two actors assisting either side with respect to any of their cyber operations, sabotage, subversion, or espionage.
I can take this one. So I had to give my microphone back to the next speaker, so I'm just going to project here. But largely, we sort of went in with that hypothesis, right? We would expect to see, if we took the pulse of Yemen, that we'd see maybe some NSO malware related to Saudi spying that Citizen Labs reported on, or maybe some Iranian mobile-based stuff. We know that we've heard rumors of a very, very large Western country having a malware family there that we cannot verify. But with that, I think the status on the ground of the low grade of the infrastructure, the constant up and down of the internet there, as well as the general, hey, we're in a civil war in a relatively third world country where food and shelter and being insulated from either a Saudi bombing campaign or a skirmish occurring a couple miles up the road is much, much more important to those players than the ability to spy on or infect those things. And I think part of that too is there aren't a lot of reports of Hadi or Houthi infiltrations into enemy territory, and it's much more on the hard lines. And so the war's been at a relative stalemate in territory control, plus or minus a few percentages of land holdings for about 3 years now. And so with that, they know where they are, and they can either pool resources, Iran or Saudi Arabia or whomever can pool resources to get in there and figure out what their battle plans are and figure out what their attack vector is going to be, or they can just sort of evade it a little bit more, because I think that there's now this, we have conferences like this that are going to flame them or bring it to light if they're doing that. And so it's just easier to send an anonymous shipment of guns over there versus say, hey, like this infrastructure was eventually tied back to oil rig or the NSO group or something like that. And so that's a very long-winded way of saying we didn't see much of it, and we think that's due to the very hard skirmish activity on the ground there.
Thanks very much. Just a quick question on the widely publicized inaccuracies and mistakes in the Saudi bombing campaign in the Houthi areas. How far do you think they or their international partners are using data from mobile networks or internet networks in that targeting?
I would say, given the inaccuracies, with low confidence, I would say minimally, but we didn't see any data indicating that they were doing so.
I'm just wondering if you could contextualize the degree to which you're familiar, whether we see Kunda, either routers or servers, the infrastructure in other countries as well, whether this is a sort of anomalous case of Yemeni procurement of this specific infrastructure, or whether we see it widespread across the Middle East or Africa or even further abroad.
That's a question that's a little bit out of the current scope of our project. That being said, we do hope to do some more of these internet pulses in other countries soon.
So ask us again next year,
Yeah.
and we'll have a better answer for you.
All right.
Thank you all again. We really appreciate it.